Oh, I should have stalled a couple of seconds longer. Shoot. All right. Well, as Aaron said last week, I am his co-teacher. I was grateful that he said it that way. This is like a pilot to co-pilot relationship here. So you should all just be aware that the co-pilot is flying the plane. So if you wish to exit the plane, now is the time to do so. Otherwise, we will take off and continue as normal. We are going to be continuing through the Sermon on the Mount. Hopefully that is not a surprise. Today we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 5, 17 through 20. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word that you have given to us, that we might know how we are to live, that we might know you. I pray that you would make us attentive to your word today, and that we would open our hearts to it, and that we would seek to obey your teaching. Help us to know you more deeply through Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. So last week, Aaron talked through Beatitudes and the similitudes, ending with the passage saying that Christ's followers are to be salt and light in the world. And the last verse there, I think, feeds into what we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks. So verse 16 of chapter 5, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. This brings up the question, what are these good works? How are we to do them? What's the purpose of them? And that's what really the next large section of the Sermon on the Mount is dealing with. What are the nature of these works? How are we to live? What are we to do? And before Jesus explains or teaches through these different ways in which we are to live, he takes a moment and connects what he's saying now to the Old Testament scriptures. So that's really the theme of today. How is the Sermon on the Mount, how is the work of Christ, how are the teachings of Christ connected to, how are they a continuation of, and how are they a departure from the Old Testament scriptures? So that's what we're looking at today. So he is teaching on a mountain, as Aaron has already explained. What is the significance of the mountain? Well, in many ways, it's a new Deuteronomy, right? A new Moses. Moses going up on the mountain giving the law to the people. Before this, there was the baptism of John, right? John calling people out into the wilderness to go through the water. This is Red Sea imagery, right? The Israelites coming into the wilderness and passing through the Red Sea before they are instituted as the nation of Israel. So John calling out a new Israel. Jesus being baptized is sort of the fulfillment of this new Israel. But he's now standing up on the mountain, giving the law to the people, and he is inaugurating them as his new Israel, his new covenant people. Okay. Also, if we look back at Jesus' baptism, we have the interesting bit there where it says in chapter 3, verse 18, and when Jesus was baptized, that's verse 16. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. What is the significance of him, of the Spirit descending like a dove? Well, it's interesting. The word hover, the word hover that we see in Genesis chapter 1. I'll just flip back to it real fast. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So the word hovering refers to, is the same word that's used in Hebrew for a bird flapping its wings. This led the Jewish rabbis to teach that to refer to the Spirit as a bird, because the Spirit hovers. Traditionally, that bird was a dove. So the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters like a dove. Jesus comes up out of the waters, and a dove descends upon him, or the Spirit descends upon him like a dove. This is meant to be connecting us to the creation. So Jesus is not only inaugurating a new Israel, he is also inaugurating a new creation. So we've got two elements here. We've got Christ's people as a new Israel, and also a new creation. But there's tension here. If we're a new Israel, if Christ's people are a new Israel, ought we to follow the Old Testament scriptures the way they didn't? Or if we're a new creation, ought we to be looking for something else, something new? So, the Old Testament, do we toss it or do we keep it? Do we follow it or not? What is the nature of the continuity between the Old and New Covenant people of God? So this is what Jesus is addressing in this passage. So let's read it. Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20. I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm going to walk through this passage just verse by verse, and I'll just have a point that corresponds to each verse. 4 verses, 4 points, all asking the question, what do we do with the law and prophets early in the morning? Okay, so verse 1 of this particular section is verse 17. He has not come to abolish, but fulfill. So when he says the law and the prophets, this is shorthand for the entire Old Testament canon, right? So the law, the Torah, first 5 books, but then the prophets, many of the other writings. So when he's saying the law and the prophets, he's referring to the whole Old Testament scriptures. He uses strong language here. Do not think, literally meaning don't let the thought enter your mind. Don't entertain the notion. It's crazy to think that I'm coming to abolish the law or the prophets. Now, perhaps he had been accused up until this point of coming to particularly abolish the law. We see later in his ministry, he certainly doesn't view some elements of the law the same way as the scribes and the Pharisees do, particularly the Sabbath and ritual purification. Why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands? That sort of thing. So possibly up until this point, he's been accused of coming to abolish the law, right? You've come to do away with our way of following the law. And here he's saying, I haven't come to abolish the law or the prophets. I am affirming my fidelity to the entire Old Testament, not just the law, but also the prophets. But more than that, he's claiming that he's come to fulfill them. This is difficult. So let's think about it. What does it mean to fulfill? It seems like we have 3 options. Fulfill could mean to obey perfectly. And this is attractive as we think about it, right? He's come to fulfill the law. He's come to do the law. He's come to obey the law. He has come to follow the law perfectly the way that Israel had not been able to. And that's attractive, except for the word fulfill in Matthew's gospel is never used in connection to obedience except for once, and even that one time's a little iffy. So it's unlikely that while it is true that Christ obeys perfectly the law, it's unlikely this is the full extent of what he means here. Similarly, another option is that he faithfully interprets the law, right? That he, and we see in the sermon, he's about to say, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, right? So he's come to teach what the law means. So some have argued that that's how he fulfills the law. And that also true. Christ does come and he does faithfully interpret the law, and that's largely the point of what we're going to be talking about the next couple of weeks. However, again, in Matthew's gospel, this isn't the way fulfilled is used ever, or in any other Greek text. So it's probably, while this is true, it's probably not what Christ means by fulfill in this context. So we're left with the third option, which is that Christ is what the law and prophets were pointing to. I should have said this at the beginning, by the way. Handwriting and spelling, very much not my strong suits. I have students in the room. You are well aware of this. If you wish to politely critique my spelling, you're welcome to. However, I think I'm going to be running pretty close to time, so maybe just forgive me in your heart. Good? Okay, cool. So Christ is what the law and the prophets were pointing to. He is the fulfillment in that he fulfills he is what they said he was going to be, right? So he fulfills prophecy in that he is what the prophecy said he was going to do. But now this takes a bit of nuancing. Also, I should say I like arrows and pointing things. If that distracts you, again, forgive me in your heart. So three different ways that Christ fulfills prophecy. You have direct prophecy. So direct prophecy, as in the Old Testament said that the Messiah would be something, and then Jesus is that thing. Most obviously in Matthew's gospel, we've seen in Matthew 1, 22 and 23, Christ is born of a virgin, right? Isaiah 7:14 says the Messiah will be born of a virgin. The direct fulfillment of prophecy. Matthew 2:1 says that Christ is born in Bethlehem. In Micah 5:2, it was said that the Christ would be born in Bethlehem. Direct prophecy, right? So the law said something, or the prophet said something, and then Christ is the fulfillment of that thing. Right? That one's easy to understand. Slightly more difficult to understand is typology. We might call this indirect prophecy. So this is not the Old Testament specifically saying the Messiah will be this thing, but saying this is a type, and then Jesus is the fulfillment of that, sort of indirectly. So an example might be that we've seen in Matthew so far. He's the new Moses, right? Moses was a type. Christ was spared from slaughter by a pagan king. He delivers his people from sin. And from slavery to sin. He delivers, this teaching on a mountain. He comes out of Egypt. All these connections with Moses. The Passover lamb, right? He's the sinless, perfect, innocent one who takes on the sins of the people and atones for the sins by his death, right? So it's not like Christ will be a lamb, but here's this institution of the Passover, and Christ will come and will fulfill that prophecy. He's the son of David, right? The king. David being a type, protecting his people, defending his people, ruling justly, being men after God's own heart. And then Christ comes and is the fulfillment of that. And then last, and perhaps most what we're going to be dealing with today, Christ is the fulfillment of the moral law. So direct prophecy, there's things in the Old Testament that point literally to Jesus. Typology, more indirectly pointing to Jesus. Then there's the moral law. So in the Old Testament, there are laws governing every aspect of life. What is the purpose of this? Well, the purpose is to point to create the purity of heart, right? Purity of the people of God. But the problem is that wasn't attainable in the Old Covenant. That wasn't attainable by Israel. You'll notice they never succeed. They keep on falling away. And yet the law is still there. What is the law doing? It's pointing at them and saying, you have sin in your heart. But implicitly then, one is coming who will cleanse that sin from your heart. Right? The law and the prophets showed the people their sin and their guilt, and it pointed them to a standard of perfection that was unattainable while their hearts were unredeemed, while they were without Christ. But now Christ has come, and his new Israel will have circumcised hearts, and they will be able to obey from the heart. So in this sense, all three of these are ways in which Christ is what the Old Covenant, the Old Testament scriptures were pointing to. He is the point of them. We'll unpack this a little bit more as we go on, but up until this point, he says, I've not come to abolish the law. No, I am what the law was pointing to. I've not come to abolish the prophets or to say do away with them. I'm what they were pointing to. So now that I have come, I'm not going to do away with them. Going on to verse 18. He says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So this is the duration of the Old Testament's authority. He says, "Truly I say to you," again, more strong language, right? Reaffirming. He says, "This is true what I am telling you. Until heaven and earth pass away." Okay, does that mean never? It's curious, right? When is that? Until heaven and earth pass away. Some have argued this is a statement about the perpetuity of the relevance of the Old Covenant, right? That it will always be in effect. Does it mean that the heavens and earth will never pass away? Let's look real quick at Matthew 24. 24, verse 35. Let's see. Oh, nope, sorry. Back. That's right, yeah. 24, verse 35. "Will heaven and earth pass away?" Verse 35 says, "Heaven and earth will pass away." So yes. "But my words will never pass away." So, okay, we'll come back to that shortly. Does "until heaven and earth pass away" mean for all time or always? Well, no, it seems. Also, it's relevant that he says not heavens, right? The heavens, the dwelling place of God, but rather heaven, meaning the sky. So he's meaning sky and earth. Okay, so when will the sky and earth pass away? What is that meaning? It seems like earth and sky will pass away or will be changed at the end of the age, when the new heavens and the new earth are instituted, and when Christ comes back for his people and at the eschatological judgment. That's what we're talking about. So we're talking about, yes, sir?
Could it also be either translated or interpreted as long as heaven and earth
Yes.
have not passed away?
Right. I would say that's perfectly legitimate, right? As long as things are the way they are, as long as this age is the way it is, right? Not an iota, not a jot will pass from the law. No, I think that's exactly right. So, meaning the relevance, significance, and authority of the Old Testament will end only at the end of this age, the age that we're now in, at the beginning of the eschaton. So how long will the Old Testament have authority? Until the return of Christ. But what does this mean, right? What does it mean that the Old Testament still has authority, significance, and relevance? I mean, isn't there whole swaths of the New Testament that seem to say the exact opposite? We're not under the law, but we're under grace, right? Yes, so care is needed. And I'm not going to take the time today, mostly because I don't know how to sort through like the ceremonial law and the civil law and the moral law. Like which parts of that are still binding? Like shellfish or no shellfish? I don't like shellfish, so it doesn't really matter to me. But different types of cloth in your garments, or is that allowed? I'm not going to get into that. Maybe Aaron will. But here's what I will say. In the New Jerusalem, so I started thinking about it. Okay, if the Old Testament will be relevant, significant, and have some sort of authority until the return of Christ, well, what's going to change in the return of Christ? What's going to change in the New Jerusalem? How are things in the new heavens and the new earth going to be different from they are now? In the New Jerusalem, there will be no need for laws convicting of sin. We will not need to be shown our sin. I keep tapping this thing. I'm sorry. There will be no need for us to be convicted of sin. We will be sinless. There will be no need for us to be shown the righteousness of God, for we will be righteous. And there's no need for us to have Christ revealed to us in types and shadows, because he'll be right there, face to face. So I will suggest that the Old Testament does three things. That it convicts of sin. It points to the righteousness of God. Whew. Spelling is so hard. And it reveals Christ. I think I can say that without getting into which laws apply which. Right? We can look at the Old Testament and be convicted of our sin, be pointed to the righteousness of God, and see the beauty of Christ. And this will be relevant to all New Covenant believers until Christ returns. So that's my take on what the Old Testament is for with respect to us now. The Old Testament provides instruction in God's righteous requirements, reminders of the blessings of obedience and the curses of disobedience, and the revelation of the nature of Christ and his bride, albeit through shadows, images, etc. And on that note, let's go back now to, you don't have to turn there, it's a very short verse, but Matthew 24:35. So comparing and contrasting verse 18 here. So he says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Then in 24:35 he says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Right? The Old Testament scriptures, applicable until the end of the age. Christ's words, applicable for eternity. Right? And so, just sort of as a side note, if Christ isn't God, that's a problematic statement, right? Because he's saying that the Old Testament scriptures delivered by God will pass away, but my words will never pass away, right? He'd better be God if he's saying that, right? It's a blasphemous claim otherwise. But also, he is bringing now, right, the new order, the already but not yet. We live now in the overlap between the ages, where we still need conviction of sin, and yet we do live with Christ with us, right? His Spirit indwells us. And so we live now in the tension between those two ages. That's just the way it is. So, Christ is God. The Old Testament was pointing to him. What does it mean when he says, not an iota, not a jot will pass from the law? Well, pass means will lose force, or will fade, or will become obsolete. These words, a jot or an iota, meaning the smallest strokes in the Hebrew and Greek alphabet. So we might think of them as like an apostrophe in English, except for apostrophes are not parts of letters. It's perhaps better to think, in my handwriting being so terrible, as lots of good examples. Let's see if I can find one. Where tiny strokes of letters make the difference. I corrected it up here. So I wrote this originally like so. Is that a U or is that an A? Christ us fulfillment, right? So I went and I did a tiny stroke of a pen to make it an A. Right? This is like the difference between a Y and a G, right? What's the difference? Well, there's a little stroke of the pen above, right? Or the difference between a P and an F, right? Well, just a stroke and they're the same letter. This is the idea, which obviously you change tiny strokes, you change letters, you change words, you change meaning. There's a great example in Hebrew where if you change one tiny, into my eyes, imperceptible difference between two letters, and it goes from do not worship another God to do not worship one God. And that's a problem, right? So this caused the Jewish teachers to hold fast to the doctrine that Scriptures were unchangeable and perfect to the smallest stroke of a pen. That not the tiniest part of a letter can be changed, right? Or will pass. Because if they do, we go from not worshiping another God to not worshiping one God, right? We do away with monotheism. It's a problem. And consequently, the reverse, right? Do not worship, or, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, or the Lord your God, the Lord is another, right? It's nonsensical. So, Christ here is reaffirming that, yes, I uphold that. The law, the prophets, perfect, right? The Word of God. And they have effect and they have meaning and significance and relevance until the end of the age. He goes on and says, until all is accomplished, right? Not a dot, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. What does this mean? Some have argued that it's referring to the death and resurrection of Christ. That's attractive in some ways. I don't think that's true for various reasons. It seems more likely to be referring to the same thing that until the end of the age, right, or until the heavens and the earth pass away. It's a rephrasing of that. Until Christ returns for his people. Or maybe the best phrase for us is until all the ransomed church of God be saved to sin no more, right? That's the idea, that the law in the Old Testament will be applicable until the ransomed church of God is saved to sin no more. So the same as until heaven and earth pass away. Okay. So we go on then to verse 19. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So, this is when we get to application, right? Verse 19. What do we do? Right? Christ has reaffirmed the Old Testament scriptures are relevant and significant for us. What do we do? Heed and obey. Listen and obey. He says, when he says these commands, some question about what that refers to, right? Where's the antecedent of these? In Matthew's gospel, these never point forward. It always points back to what has just been said. What has just been referred to is the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. So Christ has not come to abolish them, therefore we are to heed them, to listen and obey. Now, again, tricky, takes discernment. So I'm going to retreat back to the position that I stated before. Right? They're still applicable for convicting of sin, pointing to righteousness, and revealing the beauty of Christ and his love for his people. So what ought we to do? We ought to read and love the Old Testament. That seems to be the most straightforward application of this exhortation. Read it, love it, listen to it. Now we'll go on in the sermon, and Christ will say many times, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And almost always it's going, and we can just kind of look forward, right? Anger, lust, right? Particularly, but also other places where it seems like he's taking it from an external to an internal, where he's saying, you've said don't murder. You've heard it said don't murder. I say don't hate, right? You've heard it said don't commit adultery. I say don't lust, right? Taking it and pointing it to the heart. And it's easy for us then to say that the way that Christ is reinterpreting or fulfilling the Old Testament is that he is applying it to the heart. I think that misses the point slightly, so let's be careful. The law was always meant to convict the heart. The righteous requirements of God as put forward in the Old Testament were always directed to the heart. Perhaps most obviously, love the Lord your God with all your heart. Clearly, God cared about his people's hearts, even in the Old Testament. So, we've got to be careful. In obeying the law, we are obeying it from the heart. And that's not fundamentally different from what was going on in the Old Testament. But the difference is that now, we, the new covenant people of God, his new creation, right? The Spirit has hovered over us and recreated us. Our hearts are circumcised. We are new. We now are able to obey the law in a way that the Old Covenant believers were not. That we, by the Spirit and with the righteousness of Christ, may attain to the righteousness that the law pointed to. So, it's silly to think that now that we have the Spirit, the righteous requirements of the law would be lessened. Right? So what he's saying is, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments, whoever says, well, yes, but the righteousness of God no longer means that, right? Or we don't need to be that holy, or we don't need to have, we don't need to take thought about that area of our life with regard to the righteousness of God. That's silly. It's tempting. We look at the law and how it addressed every area of life, and that's a little bit overwhelming. It seems that Christ is saying, well, that's not fundamentally different now. The righteousness of God is still permeates and ought to permeate. And we should not think, as Paul said, should we sin that grace should abound, right? Just because we are in Christ, does that mean we have license to sin, or should take it as license to sin, or should think of the grace of God cheaply? No, that is preposterous. Lee's going through Hebrews, right? And the warnings for unfaithfulness in the new covenant are more severe than those in the old covenant, right? He says, how much more for those who've trampled underfoot the Son of God, who've despised the blood of the covenant, right? Things in the new covenant are escalated. We have the Spirit with us, and therefore righteousness is just as important. It's not less important. So we should be vigilant in striving for holiness. He does say those who relax the commandments will be called least, and those who do them and teach them will be called great. And this does seem to refer to rewards in the kingdom of heaven, that some in the kingdom of heaven will have, that not all are equal in the kingdom of heaven. Some have more, some have less, but none lack. As Aaron and I were talking, everyone's cups are different sizes, but all of them are full to the brim. Right? So this does refer to rewards in heaven, but that does not necessarily mean that you will get to heaven and lack anything. But don't store up treasure here. Obey God. Love him. Seek his righteousness and his kingdom, and your reward will be great. Last verse. What is the nature of righteousness? Here. He says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And this can be problematic to think about, so let's be careful. Who were the scribes and the Pharisees? We'll start there. The scribes were teachers, experts in the law. They're sort of like a combination between pastors and lawyers, right? Because the Old Covenant regulated much of daily life. They would usually begin their training as children and and have continual training until they're ordained at 40. So we're talking 3 decades of instruction and practice and study. So these are the most highly respected men of the day. They're the ones who've got it right. If they don't have it right, nobody has it right. And who are the Pharisees? The Pharisees were members of a movement in Judaism. So it's not exactly a job. It's more like a group or a sect. But their emphasis was to restore the purity of the people and the culture, and to return to meticulous observance of the law. So scribes, most highly respected teachers. Pharisees, those teachers who are most concerned with particular meticulous observance of the law. So when Jesus says, in order that if your righteousness does not exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter, right? This probably, they responded with a gasp, right? Or the disciples saying when Jesus says, how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, right? The rich were those who were seemingly blessed by God. So the disciples said, well, then who can be saved, right? If not even the rich, the ones who have been blessed by God, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, who can? It's the same idea here. Well, if the scribes and Pharisees aren't righteous enough, well then, what can we mere mortals do? So Jesus is not saying here that the scribes and Pharisees are wicked sinners, right? And that they're down here and you've got to at least get over them. No, I mean, he says things like that later. That's not the purpose here. He's holding up their righteousness as real, as substantial, but he's drawing a contrast between the type of righteousness that his people are to have and the type of righteousness that the scribes and the Pharisees have. And just to be clear, this is not imputed righteousness. This is not justification. He's not saying that if we don't do lots of really good works, more than the scribes and the Pharisees, you won't go to heaven. Aaron's point from last week and the week before, this whole sermon is dealing with the identity and character of the people of God. Who you are, who we are. So, he's not talking about righteous deeds that are leading to entrance in the kingdom of heaven, but rather our status as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, leading to righteousness. And what is the nature of that righteousness? He's not referring here to a quantitative difference, right? So the scribes fast twice a week, so you're going to fast 4 times a week, eventually to the point where you eat nothing, right? The scribes, they give, X amount to the poor, and you're going to give 3X to the poor, right? You're just going to do more than they are doing. He's not referring to beating them at their own game, right? He's referring to a different sort of righteousness. And as he will address later on in the sermon, this is not just getting a higher score in bowling. This is going from hopscotch to figure skating, right? This is a different sort of thing. And I don't want to trespass on what Aaron's going to talk about in the next couple weeks, but just a few sort of handles to think about what is the nature of this righteousness. It's concerned with the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law, right? So often when you read or when you come up against conviction of sin or are pointed to a standard of righteousness, it's easy to say like, well, yes, I will follow that part of the command, knowing that I'm holding a loophole for myself here, right? Like I'm going to recast the law in terms that I know that I can meet, I can overcome, but I know that I've kept I've kept a way out for myself here. I'm going to try to check the box, but I know that I'm not really following what the law is intended to do. I'm not submitting myself to the intentions of the teaching. So spirit rather than letter. Don't look for loopholes. Internal rather than external. So, while I argued before that the law was always intended to have application to the heart, was always intended to affect the heart, it was not always interpreted that way. And it was easy over time for the Jewish teachers to interpret the law as a set of things that we do external to ourselves, and that if we can just do the ritual purifications and not, walk too far on the Sabbath or not touch anything unclean, that will result in internal purity, or that will be sufficient for the righteousness of God. And the rest of Jesus' teaching in the sermon do pierce to the heart and are not as concerned with the externals. Also, major on the majors. Don't neglect the big things and then think that you're righteous because you do the little things. Jesus talks about the straining out a gnat and then swallowing a camel, right? Thinking you're righteous because you strained out the gnat when you swallowed the camel. He says you tithe on the herbs from your window boxes, right? But then you neglect justice and mercy. He says tithing on the window boxes is great. That's good, right? But don't neglect the big things. So place emphasis on what the law places emphasis on, right? And don't you see in all of these, right? Trying to get around what the law is doing, right? I'm going to be righteous by doing this thing, right? Or by doing this part of the law. But I'm going to close my eyes to what it's obviously trying to do in my heart. And then last, character versus commands. This is much less about what we do, and as Aaron has been saying, much more about who we are. So these will hopefully just be handles or summaries that we can use as we go forward and as Aaron walks us through the antitheses in the next chapters or the next sections.
Josh,
Sir?
I'm wondering if the word that's translated exceeds,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we miss the nuances
Yes.
of Greek, and I don't know Greek, but
Mhm.
I know that sometimes there are cases that are used for different nouns and adjectives
Yeah.
that emphasize rather than quantity, they'll emphasize quality.
Quality. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if exceeds is one of those words that, when we see exceed, we think, okay, I got to get higher
100 rather than 50.
rather than better.
Right.
You
Yeah.
you want a Mercedes instead of a Chevrolet here.
As we all would.
Not a bigger engine. But
Right.
you want just a whole better thing.
A better thing.
And Paul talks about the righteousness of God. Philippians 3:9 says, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law,
Mm-hmm.
but that which comes through faith in Christ.
Mm-hmm. A different
And-
sort of thing.
Yeah, and the whole book of Hebrews has been talking about Christ is better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not just more righteousness,
Yeah.
but it's a different type of
And so
righteousness.
now, in this sermon, Jesus is telling us, Jesus as the Christ is saying, have a better righteousness than the Pharisees and
Yeah.
scribes.
A different sort of thing. Yeah, no, that's great. I can't answer the grammatical aspect. Maybe Aaron could, but
Not this morning.
not this morning. Fair enough. No, that's great. Okay. Conclusion, what do we do? So in this small section, Christ has established the nature of the continuity between the old and the new. And this will serve as the foundation for the rest of the sermon, or at least the next large section of the sermon. So just a few concluding thoughts or application points. What do we do with this? I think, as I said before, love and read the Old Testament. See in it the beauty of Christ. He's there all throughout it. That's its purpose. And then, unlike all of these, submit yourself to the Word of God. Read it and allow it to convict of sin, to point to righteousness. Be soft-hearted when you read the Word, particularly the Old Testament, but all of it. And then strive for righteousness in every area of life. Not as a means of becoming a child of God, but because you are a child of God. Right? This is your nature. This is your identity. This is your character. So when Christ says that if your righteousness does not exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven, he's saying, all of my people who enter the kingdom of heaven have this character, have this righteousness. So work from the pleasure of God, not in order to gain the pleasure of God. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Aaron.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was a beautiful exposition. Question on verse 19.
Yes.
When you say heed and obey
Yes.
the Old Testament commands, just so there's no confusion about do we go offer sacrifices now and
Yeah.
obey the food laws, that means heed them and obey them as they are interpreted for us through Christ.
Yes.
And the new covenant.
Yes. Yep. Thank you. Don't go offer sacrifices. That's already been done. Good. Anything else? All right. Thank you for your attention. You're dismissed.